Yay. So, hello everybody out there in YouTube land. Yay. Hang on, sorry. So, what are we looking at tonight? We're looking at ground, aren't we? So, yeah, so for everybody tuning in, we're talking about Hegel's Science of Logic, and we are looking at ground. Last time we talked about absolute ground, and the next was determinate ground, and I think it was like real ground, and then conditions. And that's the end of the chapter on ground. Now, I'll be honest with y'all, the description that Hegel gives to ground is difficult to get through, even under the best of circumstances. And I didn't really understand why, because, one side of ground refers to itself on the one side, and on the other, ground refers to itself as to its content. But they're unified. So they're basically pointing at each other. And I kept thinking to myself, what does this sound like? And then I picked up Harris's wonderful commentary on the logic called "An Interpretation of the Logic of Hegel" by Errol Harris, and he tells you straight out, you are in the territory of, drumroll please, the sophists. So if you've ever taken a science class and you have been, well, the law of gravity, for instance, has been explained to you. And the way that they explain it is basically a tautology. Like gravity, the force of gravity exists because these bodies move, relative to each other and thus create gravity through rotation and, you know, ellipses around the sun and so forth and so on. And all they're really doing is pointing the explanation is pointing back at itself as sort of a complete tautology. It's not really an explanation. It doesn't really give you what, say, gravity is actually ground in for real. Now, Hegel says that the real ground of any phenomenon in reality is what ends up being the category. Okay, so at this stage, when he talks about ground being the unity of identity and difference, right? What he's talking about the structure of trying to ground something. Um, uh, does anyone mind if I just read straight out of the commentary? Because I think he puts it better than I ever could, and it's not really that long, and it kind of explains where he's going with that. But before I do that, I'll leave it to you, Jim, and to you, Kyle. Any preliminary comments? Any impressions from the science of logic?
Something
Explanation.
prescient about that because get to the late 19th century, the tautological nature of scientific explanations became a major topic of discussion among physicists and philosophers of science. I mean, it was addressed to people like Hertz, then Ernst Mach later on were addressing the issue. And they were drawing the conclusion that the structure of physics needed to be rethought, and they became skeptical of the notion of force. They became skeptical of that. So what's that mean? Yes, because any explanation in terms of forces turns out to be a tautology.
Yeah. It's a little, I'm trying to compare it to other things that have previously been used in science, like the ether or,
Yeah,
older explanations or, sort of like versions of matter, but I'm not sure it's exactly it's exactly the same kind of thing. Um,
yeah,
when
ether
the
is a good example.
What's that?
Ether, I think, is a good example, and also,
Or even the four elements, like the four elements basically point back to the water that you can see
yeah,
already or that you can imagine, and this is made of so many parts of earth, air, fire, and water kind of things. um so yeah. Okay. All right, so I guess I was onto something there. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading because this is relatively really quick, compared to other times I've read out loud. So yeah, okay. So he says, ground is the unity of identity and difference, and this is from the encyclopedia, section 121. A whole or system is just such unity. It is one, and its unity is constituted by the intermesh of the differences which made it up. As a jigsaw puzzle is made up and united into a whole by the fitting together of its interlocking pieces. Further, ground is essence posited as a totality. Okay. It is essence because it is the explanatory ground. The principle of structure explains the differences and disposition of the details. It is this principle of structure which binds them together into a single whole, and when it is set out in its explicit pattern, it is the ground of all that it contains. So when you're talking about, say, capitalism, and you're looking at the whole of a whole system of capital, and then you start considering the lowest category, the commodity. Marx says repeatedly throughout all three volumes of Capital that the commodity is ground by the system already being there. This is one major example of the part and the whole being used, and it being necessary that it's used in that way to ground the commodity. So, Harris goes on, but qua essence, it is totality reflected into itself, and therefore its dual aspect comes to the fore as ground expressing itself in a consequent. Okay, so you have a ground and a consequent. Fundamentally, the content of both is the same, but they reflect into one another, and one is represented as essential, the other as inessential. And if you've heard this before, you're absolutely right. Every shape of essence ends up being a slight sharpening of the picture of this of these related opposites, if you recall, or they are represented as the essential and its external expression or result. The ground is the sufficient reason, okay, and that which it supports or explains is its outcome or result. Same materials, by the way, that make this up, right? It's not two different, one and then another. It's the same thing. So we have two terms corresponding to explicans and explicandum. And my Latin is rusty, so I'm pretty sure it means something like the thing that explains and the thing that is explained, right? Is that right, Jim? Something along those lines?
yeah.
Yeah. Again, all of this is both subjective and objective, keeping in mind that these terms are as yet proleptic. I'm not sure what that means in that context. We have not reached the category of actuality, but in ground, actuality is implicit and is difficult to avoid the terminology appropriate to later subcategories in explaining those of ground. Hegel is hard put to find names for his categories which will distinguish them satisfactorily. And we we see this especially in the placement of some of these categories differently in the encyclopedia as opposed to the science of logic.
And I do think by proleptic means we're bringing them in too early. We're thinking about, yeah, so.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But this proleptic tendency is inherent in the nature of the dialectic and is especially characteristic of essence. For every phase is a reflection of being onto and into itself, and each category reflects every other and in every other so that it appears again and again in different forms. Subjectively, ground is sufficient reason, but the sufficient reason of things is always something that is, and later it transpires as objective cause. Yet again, ground may be conceived concretely or abstractly. If we stress the identity of the unity of identity and difference to the neglect of its diversity, we conceive ground abstractly. One extreme shows itself in the tendency to understand essence as self-same in both ground and consequent. The other is the insistence on repeating the content once as immediate and again as mediated. Both abstractions can be seen in an explanation such as is popularly given of lightning, that it is a discharge of static electricity from the clouds to the earth. But what is it that discharges? We say simply electricity. The content in both cases is the same. You see how that works? For the discharge is simply the lightning, and the explanation that it occurs because of an electrical charge does no more than state as mediated what was first simply apprehended immediately.
I don't think we still have a good explanation meteorology for that yet either. We have a theory.
Yeah.
It's still not been fully proven, so I can say that.
Yeah, but when the weatherman gets up there, he literally just repeats the tautology because that's the idiom. There's no other idiom to use. I'm sure he doesn't get that detailed though. The opposite abstraction is to insist on difference without regard to identity, which results in the exploration of grounds of all kinds for every proposition or event, grounds both for it and against it, and to elaborate these ad lib in abstraction from the actual determining circumstances and the laws that govern them, or the principles relevant to the matter in hand. Thus, in legal and moral concerns, all sides and every aspect of each case can be examined and pursued by all sorts of casuistry. Thieving, it may be argued, is indeed violation of the right of property, but also the needs of the thief must be taken into consideration and the superior capacity of the rich to provide for lost possessions, etc., etc. This is what we usually call sophistry. And Hegel points out that historically the sophists came into prominence when traditional customs and religion were in decline and a ground had to be sought and an explanation or rationalization given for every demand and activity. The complete and scientific explanation of whatever explanandum is the concept, the true ground. But the finite sciences think in terms not of the concrete, self-differentiating universal, but of an abstract universal which embraces a number of externally related particulars identified only by an alleged similarity. The manner of explanation is then to formulate a law under which a number of like cases are subsumed, and the law is then given as the sufficient reason of whatever can be deduced from it or brought under it. It's one of the reasons why the run-of-the-mill scientific method basically means that you can test some parameters, a whole lot of times right now, and the law would hold. But say 100 years from now, and some of the variables change, and suddenly that law dissolves as if it never were, because you've identified new conditions, so on and so forth. True explanation, and this is where Hegel, true explanation or proof in dialectical logic is nothing more nor less than the tracing out of the development of the concept or whole itself, its self-specification. And this was Marx's project in Capital, by the way, on that specific concept, on capital. It is the process of self-explication of the system of the real, and explanation is seeing or finding the proper place of each phase and item in the light of the whole and its principle of order. So when Harris says this, I'm immediately reminded of what Hegel says about previous philosophical systems. Kyle, I remember we were talking about Kant and Spinoza over the weekend, and Alex over and over again said, okay, that's an external matter, and the only issue that really we need to look at is the self-explication of the concept as it goes through from sheer being to the absolute idea, and he's right, but that doesn't mean that you cannot figure out where Kant fits into that system or Spinoza. And Hegel very consciously tries to fit it into his system. Sometimes, as I believe, sometimes erroneously.
Yeah.
Because the Prussian police are watching and waiting for him to endorse Spinoza and his views. So it's not something he could do, or he's going to end up like Fichte and lose. I forget if Fichte loses his job. I know a number of people did. Okay, where was I? Yes. This is in truth, as we shall see later, teleological explanation, not merely explanation in terms of efficient causation, which at this stage is the basic relation under which sufficient reason is being conceived. Strictly, causation is a category still to be deduced, but ground is conceived largely through, though vaguely and in varying degrees, as causal explanation. I think Houlgate would have a problem with that piece of commentary, to be honest, because if causation hasn't been derived yet, it's a little like talking about being, or I don't know, some of the earlier categories of being. Hegel breaks out very specifically that he's not talking about a place or a time, okay? And so it's illegitimate to try to make reference to them before they're actually derived logically, which we don't even get to, in those cases until the philosophy of nature. So the structure of causation, of what becomes causation, it may be more correct to say that the moments of ground and consequent and conditions are once they become moments of causation, in other words, their internal manifold. That makes more sense to say.
They are presuppositions of causation, not necessarily actually like a form of it ahead of time.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, and saying it that way reinforces the logical structure of what ground is, what causation is, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty damn cool that we can find a an example of why we wouldn't want to jump the gun. So anyway, okay, so he mentions Hegel talking about Leibniz and having to do with efficient causation. And then he says, in the greater logic, Hegel sets out in some detail the successive degrees of conception, concretion through which the concept of ground develops. First, it is simply an essential basis which takes various external forms. So he begins with what he calls absolute ground and specifies this as form and essence. which become form and matter in the Aristotelian sense, and thence form and content. The last pair reverses the order of the previous pair. I didn't know this, but he's right. In form and matter, form is the more specific, matter being merely the unspecified potentiality of becoming informed. Informed. In form and content, on the other hand, I see what he means by informed. In form and content, form is the more general and external, whereas content is specific and determinate. In the encyclopedia, these double subcategories appear elsewhere, but their place in the dialectical series is in any case ambiguous because, in effect, all categories of essence have this dual aspect of inner and outer, content and form, essential and inessential. And every chapter he repeats those exact words, especially the essential and essential, to try to orient the reader, as the reader goes along. Hegel proceeds in the greater logic to a second triad, which he subdivides into formal ground, real ground, and complete ground. Formal ground is simply the enunciation of a law or principle as explanation, which, when examined, turns out to be no more than a summary statement of what is explained. A merely formal and tautological explanation. For example, the law of gravity is given as sufficient reason of the revolution of the planets around the sun. In other words, the motion happens because of gravity. But have you explained what gravity actually is? Like what it actually is. But when we seek to discover what gravity really is, all the scientists can tell us is that it is the force of attraction which causes the planets to move as they do around a gravitational center. The motion of the bodies is attributed to a force or to two forces, gravitation and inertia. But when we ask what the forces are, we can describe them only in terms of the motion of the bodies. Hegel points out similarly that to explain the shape of a crystal in terms of the disposition of its molecules is simply to invoke the same form over again, for the disposition of the molecules is the disposition of the parts of the crystal. It's the same. You're still dealing with the parts and the whole, and just ricocheting back and forth. The extreme case is Molière's satire on such explanation. The reason why opium causes sleep is that it has a virtus dormitiva. Yeah. Moreover, the formal ground is so general that it will explain many diverse facts and phenomena other than what is explained for which it was originally invoked. Gravity is the universal law of motion for all bodies in the universe, however they move, and not only of the planets in our solar system. What is really required is a ground of the different kinds of motion which will differentiate one from another. Hang on just a second.
So virtus dormitiva is the essentially sleep inducing virtue. So yeah, opium causes sleep because it has this something to sleep with it, which just makes you kind of also think about this time how magic came about it being able to pull an essence out of things because it thought in this manner.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, we must not forget that ground can be taken abstractly as well as concretely, and that Hegel is both criticizing the abstract interpretation and deducing the legitimate concept. The law of gravity is a universal law, and concretely developed, it is the principle which specifies itself as different kinds of motion according to the relevant circumstances, spatio-temporal or whatever, in which the body is concerned or disposed. But if scientific explanation is no more than it is said to be by contemporary pundits who describe a scientific system as a formal deductive system and explanation as formal deduction from higher laws to subordinate laws and thence to observable consequences, What we have is precisely what Hegel regards as formal ground, especially when laws are said to be merely statements of constant conjunction of particular facts. Explanation that can be nothing but tautological restatement, either of the law or the description of the phenomena to be explained. For formal deduction is held to be purely analytic. I wish Doug was here because his alarm bells would be going off right now. And inductive generalization no more than the reiteration of what is constantly observed. So if you have an analytic Marxism that tries to relitigate the whole of Marxism is basically the sort of tautological set of propositions, then you've effectively deconstructed what Marxism is actually supposed to be based on, in part, all of these logical categories, including the part and the whole, which you can see in capital, and turn them into a set of tautological propositions. You're going backwards, not forwards, in terms of innovating. I'm sorry to say. The next stage in ground makes the ground determinate or real, and that's where we started reading for today. To remedy the defect of formal ground, the generality of the explanation, I think, explanans is specified into individual events. It is the impact of one billiard ball upon another that causes the second to move, or the collapse of the pillars under Samson's thrust that brings down the Philistine temple. But now the question arises, which among all the numerous conditions involved are the essential ones constituting the real ground? We select from among those we consider to be necessary conditions, but then we find that they are not sufficient, and what we seek is the sufficient reason. At this stage, because the grounds proliferate into a multiplicity of conditions, it is arbitrary which we select, and so Hegel says, we may give all sorts of grounds for any phenomenon or event, and we can find good grounds for whatever we please, either for it or against it. Grounds in this sense are contingent, as with the billiard ball, which could be set in motion equally well by other causes, and as many can be found for the opposite action as for the one to be explained. But this is only when we fail to identify the true grounds, or the system within which the event occurs. When we fail to see the ground in the concept of whatever it is we seek to explain. Finally, we discover that no reason is sufficient short of all the conditioning circumstances, and that in the end involves everything in the world. John Stuart Mill came to the conclusion that the only really adequate causal account we can give is that the cause, philosophically speaking, is the sum total of the conditions, positive and negative, taken together. The whole of the contingencies of every description which being realized, the consequent invariably follows. But as the consequent, philosophically speaking, is equally complex and comprehensive, it should follow that the state of the universe at one instance is the cause of the state of the universe at the next. This is indeed complete ground, but it is altogether futile, for it explains nothing and fails to identify either ground or consequent in any precise way. In complete ground, formal and real ground are united. Ground has now broken down into conditions, which is in the next chapter. Well, actually, no, it was in this chapter, yes.
So he doesn't expand upon it like as Hegel does in the Science of Logic.
Yeah, he doesn't. He jumps right into existence, which I find interesting. I don't know. Maybe he was in a hurry. It is in effect the unconditional whole which conditions all finite things. Its moments are necessary condition and sufficient condition, which unite as necessary and sufficient condition, and this gives rise to existence. And that's And that's where his commentary ends on ground. So from there, Kyle, I'm gonna push it over to you because you've read conditions more than I have, or maybe you haven't. I don't know.
I have. It's just I had trouble following what I was reading because I kind of, again, it's hard to keep these things held in your head,
Yeah.
hold these things firmly.
So he starts with the relatively unconditioned, and then
Yeah,
and then the absolutely unconditioned, an emergency of the fact into existence. Um,
in this case, it's kind of similar. He finds out that the condition itself is only because we found it's a conditional ground, right? It's like it's not necessarily in another condition, which itself is grounded in another condition. So it's that infinity we've seen before. But I didn't really follow too well how he gets this, but it's yet again an example of the finite and infinite kind of redefining itself.
yeah,
So the conditions itself, and that the second condition itself, I guess it's kind of the idea that the condition itself is both ground and condition, and this is a thing that itself continues on and on. And
yeah,
so, yeah, and that's how you become absolutely unconditioned because it's a perpetual conditioning. So
yeah,
by the time the condition comes, it gets, used up and becomes, the presupposition of the current condition.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
If you turn to 481, he actually gives the answer on 481 in the next chapter, existence. So he says, just as the proposition of ground states that whatever is has a ground or is something posited or mediated, so too we must formulate a proposition of existence. And in these terms, whatever is exists. The truth of being is to be not a first immediate, but essence that has emerged into immediacy. But when further it was also said, whatever exists has a ground and is conditioned, mirroring exactly what you said,
mhm.
then equally it must also be said that it has no ground and is unconditioned. For existence is the immediacy that is emerged from the sublating of the mediation by which ground and condition are related, and in emerging, it sublates this emergence itself.
Right. And so like the one of the grounded and the conditioned find themselves to be essentially the same thing. And though that's like they presuppose each other and they again kind of form a new unity as like you said, its existence.
Now, now, okay, recall, okay, that we are in the doctrine of essence, and so what he's talking about is the process of thought being formed, okay, and because this is a realm that is, but also is indifferent to being. Um, it's you could almost picture it as the firmware in our head in its cogs moving and making all of this stuff happen. And so when you're thinking about something um, and trying to reason out what you see in front of you, um, the conditions for the existence of anything or even any idea are going through this sort of simultaneous, all at once process of processing what you see in front of you in reality and turning it into thoughts in the thought space, right? And he's mapping this out, right? And ground going into conditioning. I mean, you can kind of see how the thought processes that show up historically, like with the sophists.
You muted yourself
Oh,
somehow.
yeah, sorry about that. So you can see in the historical examples how thought processes are historically conditioned. Not to throw a pun in there or anything, but you know, according to Hegel, the sophists emerged because the state had started to break down in terms of being able to provide grounds for everything, and so grounds had to be found, right? And in these days of capitalist degeneration, we see reactionaries coming forth with all sorts of outlandish explanations for everything. Aliens built the pyramids, et cetera, where those explanations never existed before. You know, et cetera. I don't know where I was going with that. Sorry. Anyway, I'm not sure where to go from there. Sorry.
I think one of the things I think I also got out of this because I started listening to a podcast about history a friend of mine recommended, and it in the intro, and he of course gets into this. So this reminded me of it to talk about. Well, there's many different ways, to interpret history. You can have this one line and this such, but the truth is to take all into account. It's like, yeah, you can find a ground in anything. So there's many history, descriptions of history that each have their own separate thing they call their sufficient ground, and things end up, they don't necessarily they're just I think how to say that, but they're kind of describing the same thing indifferently, so that may appear to be different interpretations. No, they are different interpretations, but they may not necessarily sync up or give the same explanations that match up because they've thrown away certain things as inessential that others might find essential. It just reminded me of that. That's the thing we run into when we try to read history.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to find an essential ground well, yeah, like I said, anything can be determined as a ground.
Yeah. Yes. And it's such a it's such a stark statement about our current ability to do science in general, and in what ways specifically that it is missing real scientific explanation. In terms of relating what is to its actual conditions versus just sort of holding a mirror up to the phenomenon and saying, look, it exists, which is, what Harris was saying is exactly what even some of our fundamental theorems about gravity or this or that thing actually are just sort of a set of propositions or axioms that are supposed to be self-evident. They even call them that. Oh well, gravity is self-evident. We're experiencing it. Well, one of the lessons of the phenomenology is that not everything that you experience is actually what you think it is. In fact, it's a great deal less than what you think it is. Another thing I wanted to talk about. I brought it up in Alex's class, but I didn't really get to like really get to it. Was that in our thought process, just everyday thought processes, the logic wasn't written out to sort of map what happens every time we start thinking about something. Rather, to be honest, the fact is that the way we encounter things experientially and start thinking them through, and then maybe come to a scientific explanation of them that's actually logically adequate, I think that cycle is given in the philosophy of spirit. because you know you run through hang on just a second.
Or just
If I bring it up, I should actually like reference the real thing as opposed to what I think is written in there. Does it even have a table of contents? Yeah. So let's see. So there's spirit. Wow. There's spirit subjective, and then there's spirit objective, and then there's absolute spirit, which in this Oxford version is called mind. It's William Wallace. That's why. So you have the physical soul, you have the feeling soul, you have the actual soul, and then consciousness proper, self-consciousness, and reason, and that's basically the phenomenology of mind or spirit. Sorry, and then you have psychology, which is the theoretical mind or theoretical spirit, practical spirit, and then the free spirit, which is the unity of the two. And then you get into law, the morality of consciousness, of conscience, the moral life or social ethics, and and he gets especially at the end into discussions about the family, civil society, and the state. And as we all know, the social ethics is further elaborated in the philosophy of right. And then you have absolute mind, which covers art, revealed religion, and philosophy. And so the cycle of thinking about anything subjectively for any of us depends not only on the conditions of whatever we're trying to explain and ground, but also our conditions, our conditions. If I were a religious man, my thought process subjectively would be vastly different from a scientific man starting out. And that's one of the points I think Hegel tries to make in the philosophy of spirit at the very end, which is that, not only is this how thought works, but subjectively each and every one of us approaches all of this from different places depending on our own conditions. It's kind of profound if you think about it. Because in the logic, he gives us mostly the universal preconditions that thought uses to think, but then he gets more into the particular and the individual in terms of where we come from in approaching thinking about anything, even about ourselves. Oh, that was really heavy. Someone else talk. Sorry. I'm kind of came to a stopping point on that point.
I don't think I got much else I can think of right now.
Yeah.
So I did find a digital copy of Holgate's Hegel and the Philosophy of Nature he edited. Just gotta figure out how to download it.
Ah, yes, this one.
Yeah, I'll order it eventually. I just wanted to see what was in it. Seems specific, at least to nature, which I was wanting.
Yeah, it's a set of articles where uh, half a dozen to a dozen different writers sort of address one issue or another to do with the philosophy of nature. Um, and really the purpose of it was no one was talking about it much at the time, and so either he organized something or there was a conference or whatever it was, and he collected up all the papers and wrote it into a book, which, I mean, it was like late 70s, early 80s, I think. I forget. Um, oh, okay. It's 1998.
Yeah.
And one of the points he makes in it is that the philosophy of nature, of course, has two sides of it. There's the logical side, which you can easily access by just reading, the Oxford. But then there's the side of it that is able to situate the history of nature at the time that Hegel wrote it, and sort of give you sort of an overview of what he was working with in terms of content, because real philosophy, unfortunately, is marred by the fact that the contents that make it up are vastly outdated today. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the form, that the logical categories were wrong. Mostly because the logical categories to do with nature are so fundamental that we still use them today. We talk about matter, we talk about space and time, and those kinds of things. And so that's, I think, a little snippet of what you're going to get out of that book. I haven't read it all the way through, but I've skimmed it, and yeah, it's basically trying to untie certain knots, which people have neglected. He also, in that book, he also refers to M.J. Petrie's 3-volume copy of Philosophy of Nature, in which Petrie basically goes through and gives a scholarly commentary as he goes to as many inches of the philosophy of nature as he possibly can, in order to illuminate the text for the modern reader. When I say modern reader, I'm talking like the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, I think. He also did some work on the subjective spirit, especially in a separate book called The Berlin Phenomenology, in which he compares the original book to the Berlin Phenomenology that you'll find in the Philosophy of Spirit, and talking about how they're different, very, very different, but also the same, because they follow the same general categorical shape, but when you're talking about the philosophy of spirit and the actual experience as set down in the original phenomenology, they're two different things. We still need the ladder to science, which is why the phenomenology, I don't think, will ever be outdated, especially considering it centers the French Revolution, and that was such a pivotal moment in the history of well, in our is that early modern or just modern? Anyway, French Revolution is still operative today. And if y'all have noticed, the new Project 2025 is calibrated to try to attenuate or destroy any part of the legacy that the French Revolution inaugurated. The era, in order to turn it back into an absolutist state. I don't know if you guys have you looked at this thing yet. They've been sharing it in memes online.
Where'd you put it? Sorry,
What's that?
where you put?
Where did I put what?
Sorry, you say you're referencing what online?
Oh, Project 2025,
Oh yeah.
the presidential transition project. Let's see here. End no fault divorce. Complete ban on abortions without exceptions. Ban contraceptives. Additional tax breaks for corporations and the 1%. Higher taxes for the working class. Eliminations of unions and worker protection. Raise the retirement age. Cut Social Security, cut Medicare, and the Affordable Care Act. And it goes all the way down, to include like increase Arctic drilling. I don't know who wrote out the meme or if this comes directly from Project 2025. I've heard it's like a 900-page document that probably doesn't have this table of contents, but it probably contains all of these. End birthright citizenship, ban Muslims from entering the country, so on and so forth. Sorry, I kind of took a left turn into the political there.
That's fine. So at some point, ever looked at Project 2025, I'll look at its precursor. Was its actually sure to read something. It's been a long time since I've heard of this at all.
Mm.
The well, now it's me got shared recently. Yeah, it's Project for the New American Century.
Yeah, and they've had previous documents of wish lists that they've wanted to put out. It's just that they didn't exactly have a rubber stamp Supreme Court to make it all happen. And now they do, which I hope with someone or other, sparks a new look at the institution. It probably won't though, because the only other party besides the Republicans is the Democrats, and they're not about to start shooting out the lights at the Supreme Court.
It's only been really a couple of times in U.S. history where the legitimacy of the Supreme Court has been directly challenged. One time was during the Civil War. Lincoln administration went after the Taney Court, which was an extremely reactionary court, which had upheld slavery. That's why Lincoln packed the court, and he also often blatantly ignored the court. Court would make a ruling when Lincoln would say, let them enforce it.
Yeah,
And basically, the court cannot enforce any ruling. It's up to the president and the Congress to do that. And if they decide to ignore the court, there's nothing the court can do about that.
yeah.
And so that was one time. The second time, of course, was when FDR tried to pack the court during his second term. Which failed at the time, but FDR was in office long enough that he was able to appoint enough new justices to get a court more amenable to what he was doing.
Yeah, and you'll notice in both cases, they're their method of challenging the court wasn't simply storming the place and arresting the judges. it was maintaining its institutional integrity by getting into power and then appointing judges to pack the court.
Yeah.
Like the court was still seen as essential to the way the U.S. ran. And as long as that's the case, it doesn't matter how reactionary things get, as we're seeing in India right now. If the institution is thought of as constitutional, and I say that in the lowercase c constitutional sense, the task of actually challenging the Supreme Court as a body is a working class task by necessity, because we're the ones who are subject to its dictates if Congress decides to uphold it through enforcement action. So yeah. Okay, let's switch gears really quick to just talk about the next part. So we have come to ground, so to speak. The first section on illusory being, I believe it is. Is it?
Yeah. Illusory being the essential.
Essence as reflection within itself. So
Yeah.
that's section 1. So basically, how thoughts are formed in our thought space is, I guess, another way to put that. But then if that's what it means, what are we moving on to with
The appearance?
with appearance? Essence must appear, which is literally the first line.
We're about to read about Cronenberg's 1999 movie.
There you go.
Apparently, The Matrix at the same time The Matrix was released.
Yep. It's funny. I don't think I've seen any of Cronenberg's movies. I probably should.
I was okay with crap. I can't even think of the movie at this point. Videodrome.
That's funny because A under appearance is The Thing and its properties,
Mm-hmm.
and the Thing was a movie. So
Yeah. So yeah.
it's kind of hilarious. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we read from 479 through 492. That's 479 to 492. Basically from section 2, appearance, all the way through the Thing and its properties.
There you go.
Actually, if we really want to be ambitious, we could go from 479 to the end of chapter 1.
Yeah, because there's not a lot left at that point.
Yeah, it's not actually very long. I'm just not sure that. Yeah, that's what I'm going to suggest. 479 to 498.
If we need to split over 2 meetings, we can.
Yeah. If we find lots of stuff to talk about, and we don't get all the way through, then we definitely can do that. But I think that is the order of the day. I wonder how fast we could actually get through a lot of this, because after yeah, go ahead. After existence is appearance, and then the essential relation. We could run into the notion in general before we know it.
What if we caught up to Alex? at this rate.
I'm not sure that's going to happen, to be honest, because we have a lot of ground to cover, and it's not like this stuff has ever
We-
been.
We've covered ground.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. You're breaking my brain, Kyle. All right, cool. So we got ground under our feet, and now we need to an essence must now appear, whatever that means. All right, comrades, you have a wonderful night, and we'll talk Hegel in a week and start talking about the thing and its properties, among other things.
All right.
All right. Take care.